Think about the last time you actually paid for music. Not a subscription, I mean really paid for it. Walked into a store, went online and bought a song or an album because you wanted to own it. Most of you can't remember, and that's the whole point. Spotify didn't just beat the competition. They didn't just win a market share battle against Apple Music or Tidal or Pandora. They went in and fundamentally rewired how an entire generation of people think about music as a product. They made ownership feel obsolete. They made paying per song feel like something your parents did. And they did it so smoothly, so gradually, that most people never even noticed it happening. But here's what's wild. The thing that made Spotify so dominant, the very strategy that got 500 million people completely dependent on their platform, also guaranteed that one day they were going to raise prices on you. That was always part of the equation. It was built into the model from the beginning. So today we're going to pull the whole thing apart. How Spotify went from a scrappy Swedish startup that the music industry wanted dead to one of the most deeply embedded platforms in the history of media. What their actual business model looks like under the hood, why the price hikes are just getting started, and what this entire story tells us about how the most successful platform businesses in the world are built. Quick intro for anyone new here. I'm an entrepreneur. I built and scale multiple businesses across tech and media. And this channel is where I break down the strategy, the business models, and the moves behind the companies and ideas that are actually reshaping industries. If that sounds useful to you, stick around and hit like and subscribe. Also, I know this is not the best background. I just moved, but I will be designing a new studio. All right, let's go back to the beginning. To understand what Spotify actually built, you need to understand the world they walked into. And the word I'd use for the music industry in the mid-2000s is desperate. Napster launched in 1999. Within about 2 years, they had somewhere around 80 million registered users sharing music for free. The labels panicked, sued them into the ground, and shut them down. And then immediately, like 6 other file sharing services popped up to replace them. LimeWire, Kazaa, BearShare. The internet had figured out that music could be free, and there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. Album sales fell off a cliff. Between 2000 and 2010, the recording industry lost about half its revenue, and the labels responded the way a lot of legacy industries respond to existential threats. They got litigious and they got slow. The RIAA, which is the Recording Industry Association of America, started suing individual people, not the platforms. There's a famous case where they sued a 12-year-old girl for downloading songs on Kazaa. Another case where they went after a grandmother who didn't even own a computer. The PR was catastrophic, and it didn't stop a single download. Then Apple swooped in with iTunes in 2003 and gave the industry something to grab onto. Buy songs for 99 cents, buy albums for $9.99. It was legal, it was reasonably easy, and it gave the labels a digital revenue stream at a moment where they were drowning. But the model had a fundamental flaw that nobody really wanted to talk about. Buying individual songs on iTunes was still a worse experience than just downloading them for free. Not because of the price necessarily, but because of the friction. You had to find the song, decide you wanted to pay for it, enter your payment info, wait for it to download, manage your library. Meanwhile, on LimeWire, you searched, clicked, done. It was free and immediate. The music industry was still losing because they were competing on moral grounds instead of product grounds. They kept saying piracy is wrong, piracy hurts artists, pay for your music. And they were right. But being right doesn't win markets. Having a better product wins markets. Nobody had built something that was genuinely, undeniably more convenient than piracy. And that was the opening Daniel Ek walked through. Daniel Ek was 23 years old when he started building Spotify. He'd already sold the company before, had some money, and had spent a lot of time thinking about why digital music was still such a mess. And he landed on a diagnosis that was different from everyone else's. His view was that people don't pirate music because they're criminals or because they hate artists. They pirate it because the legal alternative isn't good enough. Fix the product and he fixed the behavior. So he set out to build something that was better than piracy. Not just legally better or morally better, functionally better, faster, more complete, more convenient, and he made it free. Spotify launched in Europe in 2008 with a free ad-supported tier that gave you access to essentially the full catalog. Not a trial, not a limited library, everything. You searched for a song and it played. No downloading, no file management, no waiting. It streamed instantly over the internet in a way that felt almost magical compared to what people were used to. The free tier had ads, it had some limitations, but here's the psychology that Ek understood. Getting someone to change a deeply ingrained habit requires removing every possible barrier to entry. If there's any friction between a person and your product, they will default back to what they know. So he removed the friction. The price barrier, gone. The sign-up complexity, minimized. The catalog gaps that plagued other services, mostly closed. And here's the part that a lot of business breakdowns skip over, because it's not as sexy as the product story. The premium tier was designed from day one, not as an upgrade, but as a relief. The free experience was calibrated very deliberately. Good enough to get you completely hooked on the product, but just uncomfortable enough, random shuffle on mobile, ads every few songs, no offline listening, that upgrading to the $9.99 a month felt less like paying and more like removing an annoyance you've been tolerating. That psychological framing is the whole game in freemium businesses. You're not selling a premium product, you're selling relief from friction introduced on purpose. Spotify grew fast in Europe. By the time they launched in the US in 2011, they had millions of users and real momentum. And they were doing something nobody had managed to do in the previous decade of digital music chaos. They were converting pirates into paying customers. A study around that period found that Spotify users were significantly less likely to pirate music than non-Spotify users. Not because they'd suddenly become more ethical, but because the product was better. The convenience gap had closed. But getting the product right was only half the battle. The other half was even harder. Here's something most people don't know, and it changes how you see the whole Spotify story. The major labels, Universal, Sony, Warner, EMI, they didn't just reluctantly agree to license their music to Spotify. They took equity stakes in the company. They became shareholders. Think about what Eck actually pulled off there. He went into negotiations with the most powerful gatekeepers in the music industry, an industry that had just spent a decade in full warfare mode against digital platforms, and he convinced them not only to license their full catalogs, but to bet on his success. The pitch was essentially, you can keep fighting the internet, or you can own a piece of the company and it's going to figure it out. And if this works, your equity stake is worth a fortune. It worked. Reports put the label's collective ownership at somewhere between 15 and 20% of Spotify at various points. When Spotify went public in 2018 at a $26 billion valuation, Universal alone reportedly made hundreds of millions of dollars from its stake. The labels, which had been screaming about the death of the music industry for 10 years, quietly made an enormous amount of money from the platform they tried to kill. But here's the tension that got built into the foundation of Spotify's business from that moment on. The labels are simultaneously Spotify's most important suppliers and its shareholders. They want high royalty rates so their artists get paid well, but they also want Spotify's stock to be as valuable as possible, which means keeping costs down. Those two things are in direct conflict, and that conflict has never been fully resolved. The royalty economics of streaming are generally rough for working musicians. Spotify pays out somewhere between 0.3 of a cent and 0.5 of a cent per stream. To earn the equivalent of minimum wage in the US from Spotify royalties alone, you would need roughly 4 to 5 million streams a year. The vast majority of artists on the platform get nowhere close to that. The superstar artists of course do fine. The top fraction of a percent who are generating billions of streams get meaningful money. But the working musician, the person making good, real music with a dedicated fan base of say 50,000 people, is not building a career off Spotify royalties. The platform basically redistributes listening time towards the most popular content, which compounds the advantages of artists who are already winning. Now, Spotify will point out they paid out almost $40 billion in royalties since they launched, and that number is real. But where that money flows and who actually ends up with it after the labels take their cut is a much more complicated story. Anyway, this is important context, but it's not the main plot. The main plot is what happened after Spotify locked in the labels, locked in the catalog, and started focusing on turning their user base into something competitors could not touch. By 2015, Spotify had around 75 million active users. Then Apple Music launched with the full force of Apple's marketing machine, 1 billion installed devices and deep integration with every iPhone on the planet. Every tech analyst assumed they were about to eat Spotify's lunch. It didn't happen. Spotify kept growing, and the reason comes down to something that doesn't get enough credit in most breakdowns of the story: their data moat. Every single interaction on Spotify generates data. Every song you play, every one you skip, the time of day you listen, what you play when you're working out versus cooking dinner versus winding down. They have hundreds of millions of users generating that signal constantly. Apple had a bigger hardware ecosystem, sure. Amazon had more money, but nobody had the depth of behavioral audio data that Spotify had accumulated. And they turned that data into products that became genuinely hard to replicate. Discover Weekly launched in 2015, and it was a meaningful cultural moment. A playlist generated fresh every Monday, full of songs you probably never heard but felt like they'd been picked specifically for you. Not in a generic algorithmic way, in a way that felt almost eerily personal. People were sharing their Discover Weekly playlists like they were a piece of their identity. Then Spotify Wrapped turned year-end listening data into the most effective annual marketing campaign in streaming. Every December, your social feed fills with Spotify Wrapped cards. Your top artists, your listening minutes, your most played songs. It's nostalgic and personal and shareable. And it's entirely free advertising generated by hundreds of millions of users who are voluntarily promoting Spotify because the product made them feel something real. Neither of those things sound like a moat when you describe them out loud, but here's what they actually are. There are reasons your Spotify account is about you in a way that no other service can match. Your history, your playlists, your taste profile, your Wrapped archive going back years. The longer you're on the platform, the more it knows you, and the more painful it becomes to walk away and start from scratch somewhere else. That's the moat. It's not the catalog which all the major services basically have access to now, it's the personalization layer that compounds over time. And then in 2019, Spotify made a move that completely changed how you should think about what they're building. They started going hard into podcasts.
Hey there, welcome back to the...
Between 2019 and 2021, they spent somewhere north of $1 billion acquiring Gimlet Media, Anchor Podcast, The Ringer, and a handful of other companies. They signed Joe Rogan to an exclusive deal reportedly worth over $200 million. They signed Alex Cooper of Call Her Daddy for reportedly $60 million. They were spending at a scale that made people genuinely question whether the strategy made any sense. Here's the strategy. People who listen to podcasts daily have stronger platform habits than music-only listeners. They spend more time in the app, they're more likely to be paying subscribers, and they're harder to peel away from the platform they built a podcast library on. If Spotify could become the place where you listen to music and podcasts and eventually audiobooks and anything else audio, the switching cost stopped being about one playlist or one recommendation engine. It became about your entire audio life. That's a completely different scale of lock-in. The podcast strategy had a rough patch. They eventually pulled back on some of the exclusive deals and made some content available more widely. But the core insight was right, and the habit formation it drove was real. Spotify's daily active users kept growing even as they were navigating the complexity of the content pivot. By 2023, Spotify had over 600 million monthly active users, more than 230 million premium subscribers, and a catalog that included music, podcasts, and audiobooks. They had become the dominant audio platform on Earth. And that's when they started charging more for it. In 2023 and into 2024, Spotify raised prices across more than 50 markets. In the US, the individual premium plan went from $9.99 to $11.99. Family plans went up, student plans went up, and by the time they were done, Spotify had made more money per subscriber than at any point in their history. People complained on social media for about a week, and then they cut their subscriptions. Because of course they did. Here's what I want you to understand about this moment, because I think there's a temptation to frame it as a portrayal. Spotify lured you in with low prices and then switched up on you. And look, I get why it feels that way. But that framing misses what actually happened. The low pricing was never permanent. It was a customer acquisition strategy. Spotify spent the better part of 15 years operating at a loss. They went public in 2018 and still weren't profitable. They were burning through cash, subsidizing your music experience with money from venture capital and public market investors who were betting on the long game. The long game was acquire users at a loss, build switching costs so deep they can't leave, and then raise prices once the moat is wide enough that most people will absorb the increase and stay. That's not some dark conspiracy, that's a well-documented, widely discussed business model that has been executed by Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney+, and essentially every major subscription platform in existence. Spotify just played it over a longer runway and with more patience than most. And the results are hard to argue with. In 2024, Spotify posted its first full year of profitability. Revenue hit record levels. Premium subscriber count crossed 250 million. Wall Street, which had been skeptical about whether the model could ever really generate real margins, finally got its answer. The bet paid off. Now here's the forward-looking piece, because this is where it gets really interesting from a business perspective. Spotify's price hikes are almost certainly not finished. Their average revenue per customer is still significantly lower than Netflix's. Their tier structure, free, individual, duo, family, student, gives them multiple levers to pull. They're starting to introduce features like audiobook access and higher quality audio that can justify further segmentation. The playbook from here is straightforward. Keep layering in features that make the premium tier feel more valuable, gradually raise prices, and convert more free users into paid subscribers. Every year that goes by, the switching cost gets a little higher and the price sensitivity gets a little lower. That's just how platform businesses age. Well, so what do you do with this information? Honestly, for most people, probably nothing. The product is genuinely good. If you're using Spotify daily, $11.99 a month is still a reasonable deal for what you're getting. The price increase stings a little, but the switching cost is real, and starting over somewhere else has its own friction. But zooming out from Spotify specifically, the thing worth taking away from this story is the pattern, because you're going to see it again and again. You've probably already seen it with several other platforms you use every day. The free or cheap entry points, the gradual deepening of habits and personalization, the slow raising of switching costs, and eventually the monetization turn. Recognizing the pattern early before you're fully locked in is the only real leverage you have as a consumer, and as someone building or investing in businesses. And as someone building or investing in businesses, understanding how this flywheel works is generally one of the most valuable mental models you can carry. Here's the thing about Spotify that I don't think gets said enough. They didn't invent this. The strategy get users hooked for cheap, build a product so embedded in their daily life that leaving becomes genuinely painful, and then gradually charge more for it, That's not a Spotify idea. That's just how the modern tech industry works. Spotify just executed perfectly on music. Netflix did it with video, Amazon did it with shopping, and then shipping, and then everything else. Google did it with search and then made it impossible to imagine navigating the internet without them. Apple did it with hardware and then quietly built one of the most profitable services businesses on earth. On top of that installed base, we are living inside dozens of these flywheels simultaneously, and most people never stop to think about it. Every app on your phone that started free, every platform that gave you a great deal in year one, every service that has spent years learning your behavior and preferences and habits, they're all in some stage of this arc. Some are still in the acquisition phase, some are tightening the moat, and some, like Spotify, had already made the turn. The ones that do it best are almost invisible about it. You don't feel the lock-in happening. You just wake up one day and realize that leaving would actually cost you something. Not just money, but time, history, convenience, and identity. That's when you know the flywheels work. So the next time a platform raises prices on you and you're annoyed for a week before shrugging and keeping your subscription, that's not weakness, it's just proof somewhere along the way they built something you genuinely needed. The question worth asking is, when did that happen and when did you even notice? That's the game. And the more clearly you can see it, the better you'll be at navigating it, whether you're a consumer, an investor, or someone building the next one. If this is the kind of breakdown you want more of, there's a lot more where this came from. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.